bring back.
Welcome to the No Flux Given podcast, episode 41. Welcome, everybody. I know there's no live feed of me anywhere on that screen, and that's okay. You know, this one's mainly for just like listening and soothing yourself with my somewhat wonderful voice. So, today's episode is going to be on Damascus. We're talking about the pitfalls, the exhilaration, the hatred, the frustration, everything Damascus. So we have that Mosaic Madness event coming up here in about a week. You know, that's where we're going to be. We're going to be in Spokane next Friday, a week from today. Getting ready for that Saturday, the 23rd and 24th. So we also want to, before we get too far into this, to talk about, once again, the new system we have in place on Patreon. And it is the new tier system. And I hope that it's going to push more people to, you know, come and see and experience this a little bit better. Because, I mean, we do have multiple options here. And we're going to go over it again. We went over a little bit yesterday. But yesterday's episode was a little testy, a little spicy, you know? The spiciness was heavy on that little cayenne pepper overload. So, but today's is going to be pretty informative, and we're going to talk about my experiences with Damascus or pattern welded steel, a little bit of the history of it, which we have done already, but it never hurts to continue to reiterate the history of something. So, all right, let's talk about our new tier system on Patreon. We have 3 tiers now instead of the one. The old tier was just Fan of the Forge. You paid $10 a month. You get access to pretty much everything. And that was great, but it's, not really allowing people to, what if they don't want all that, but they still want to support the shop, right? So basically, I think the best move I've made so far was having the 3-tier system. And the first tier is the novice tier, and it's $1 a month. And this tier is for those that wish to donate to the shop each month, feel good they gave their support, but not break the bank. And I appreciate it. Everything. I appreciate just a view and a nod. I really do. That dollar a month, though, spread over 12 months, I'll be able to buy a belt. I'll be able to buy something for $3, for $6. I'll be able to buy something I need for the shop. And I really appreciate it. Thank you. The next tier is the apprentice tier. Now, this tier is $5 a month. And it's for those that wish to get more content, like the all access pass to collections, to giveaways. We have, ad-free content, ad-free videos, and allows you to have exclusive voting power in the decision making of certain projects, right? The biggest one is the giveaways. And you get the work in progress updates, in a digital type format. So I hope that this, brings, people to the table. I'm going to continue doing it no matter what. It's a great way for me to organize my thoughts and kind of get whatever is going on in my head out, and especially since we're pushing on writing this book, it's a real good way for me to organize a lot of things. So and this is why we're talking about Damascus today. It's one of those heavily influencers within blacksmithing and bladesmithing, forge welding in general, that brings people to the table, that gets them interested. And let's talk about the third tier before we move on, is the master tier. Now, this tier is the old Fan of the Forge tier. It's $10 a month, and it's for the aspiring blacksmith or bladesmith who wants to take advantage of everything, especially my master classes coming out here in the fall. And what are those master classes? Well, it's a series of teaching videos that will be coming out, starting from the basics of the basics all the way through the most complicated forge welding there is, and the most complicated metal sculpting techniques there are. Because if you don't know, before I was a blacksmith, I was a sculptor, and I did lost wax method. We did found art method, or found object method. We did some, sheet metal work and all that good old stuff. And being able to get back to that original field of study is something that I haven't been doing for, almost 2 decades now. And, since I got out of college the first time. So, yes, I said the first time. And the thing is that I'm going to be bringing that back because it is part of blacksmithing. It is part of bladesmithing, the ability to sculpt and the tools that you need. But it's something that can be taught. Yes, there are natural artists out there. There are natural freaking metal workers, natural smiths, but they're not natural at that. They're just naturally good at picking up new skills. That's what it is. There's nobody's born like knowing everything there is to know about metal. They're just naturally gifted at picking up new subjects, new techniques, new talents, right? So, within this master tier, you're going to get those masterclass videos for $10 a month, and they'll be there forever and ever and ever. And you can download, save. I mean, that's just part of the perks. You also get $10 off all Rusty Hammer Forge merchandise, and right now it's just the merchandise. It has nothing to do with any of the items out there. So it's just like the sweatshirts, the long sleeve shirts, t-shirts, zipper hoodies, and stuff like that. To add to the ad-free content, ad-free videos, you get the live event VIP. So if I'm doing a live event where on Discord, and I'm gonna bring you all of you guys in, because you guys are at that stage to basically have a conversation with, right? You're right there to have a conversation as a blacksmith or a bladesmith, and so that's what that means. Along with that, you get the exclusive voting power rights, work in progress updates, giveaways, and the exclusive content. So those are our tier system: novice, apprentice, and master. Hopefully this brings people to the table. The novice, you guys are going to get this pretty much same thing as the novice. That when I put out a public post, you're going to get that, for the $1 a month, here on Patreon. If you want a little bit more, try out the apprentice. And if you think you'd be interested in the master class, go for the master tier for $10 a month. I appreciate it. Thank you. And let's get on with the show. Damascus. So we talked a little bit about Damascus in my Mosaic Madness event episode. And that Damascus, how it's called now, is basically the knowledge was built upon by the Syrians. All right. But they didn't invent it. It wasn't the, Damascus, Syria, which everybody for generations has been told was not the birthplace of Damascus steel. The birthplace of Damascus steel was India. All right. It was India, the Tamil people, southern India. It did. They kind of give credit to everybody, from the Far East, ancient India, the Middle East, Indonesia, and Europe. But they can trace the original stock steel to southern India. And the master metal workers of the Tamil people really pushed the pattern welded and Damascus crucible steel to its max. The Middle East, Syria, they found that they had a much superior ore and perfected and built upon the work of this southern India. Now, Europe, Indonesia, the Middle East, and the Far East, they had all this stock material, and they all built upon it and surmised this is how it was done, on their own time. But the two that really stick out are the Smiths in southern India and the Smiths in Damascus, Syria. Those are the big ones, the big two, right? That hit it right on the button. So we have pattern welded steel, which is way older than crucible steel. People tend to forget about that. Pattern welded steel is not a modern invention. I had no freaking clue, right? I mean, this is me learning, and I have no problem admitting that. Because, I mean, you're talking 1500 BCE where the pattern welded steel emerges, later referred to as Damascus steel. That's the common term we use today. But what it actually is pattern welded steel. And what is pattern welded steel? Well, pattern welded steel is when you take steel with varying levels of carbon and other alloys in it, and you forge weld them or fuse them together. And then you continue to manipulate that bundle or that billet until you have the desired outcome that you're looking for. That's pattern welded steel. All right. And it was superior to what was going on. I mean, you got to remember this. 1500 BCE. That's 200 years, 2 to 400, yeah, 2 to 300 years before the Iron Age. This is why a lot of historians say the Iron Age started in 1500 and went to 500 or thereabouts because of the emergence of the pattern welded steel. Right? But for the most part, 1300 BCE to 500 BCE was when the Iron Age was. So, I mean, you're talking, this was coming right at the tail end of the Bronze Age. Right? I mean, and you're getting a Damascus pattern welded blade of steel that seems to be imbued with magical properties. Can you imagine what that was like? I can't. I can imagine how it could be seen that way, but man, I can't imagine that how those people looked at it. Right? I just can't. I'm completely at a loss on the understanding because I don't have a reference point. You know, the only thing I could possibly, well, I can. I do have a reference point. My reference point would be uh, learning how to make crucible steel, right? And seeing it with new, fresh eyes, seeing the process, having the trials and tribulations, working through the ups and downs of it. The first time when you get it to work and you crack open the crucible and you see that piece of charcoal sitting there, like, what the hell? I mean, and then the science part of your brain kicks in and you understand why, because it's an anaerobic environment. There's no oxygen in there to burn it, but it's still hot enough to turn steel molten and glass molten. But it's not touching the piece of charcoal sitting on top of everything. It's dehydrating it. It's drying it out for sure. Because it does lose some mass. There is a little bit of carbon migration. Tiniest a bit. But that's not, you're not burning it. And it's just amazing. The whole process. And so I do have a slight reference on how these people felt, but we live in a time now to where this would be, here's a perfect example of this, of what it must have felt like. If we discovered or were introduced to anti-gravity tomorrow, it would be fantastical. It would be beyond our absolute understanding, and we wouldn't be really to fathom it. So this is what it must have felt like when the sword and steel, iron, and the sword and the knife were so prevalent, such an everyday part of our lives, such a needed and necessary tool. When you saw something like this, it would absolutely blow your mind. And then the ability to figure out how it was done absolutely was ingenious, right? So, there is this progression through the timeline as of right now where, and I've only touched the very tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to be found, which I'll find it, and it's all going in the book. But right now, I mean, you know, we're talking right now the evolution of, you know, using iron and steel in blacksmithing and bladesmithing. We're talking accepted historical timeline, 7,000 years of use, of documented use. It could be more, could be longer. But right now, the accepted historical timeline says 7,000 years, give or take. That's a long time. That is a long, long ass time. You know. So my thinking has always been this: if they could do it then, I can do it now. And so I've never really shied away from anything just because it was I wasn't it was hard, or I didn't know how to do it, because if they could figure it out then, we could figure it out now. Now we live in a time now where things are, you know, everything costs something. It was probably no different then. They had a little more, a few more skills that would allow them to do it. So they had a better understanding of materials, right? And what materials that they could use to make crucibles, and you know uh, how they would go about doing that, and that's lost today. I mean, we're a very specialized society these days, and you don't study everything right now. Majority of the population does not study everything they possibly can. They specialize. They find something that they want to study for the rest of their life, and that's what they do. And they absolutely brain dump everything else. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a little irritating at times, especially when you're a person that that wants to know everything and be good at everything. You know, that specialize those specialization people can be a little irritating, but you got to love them for what they do. Without them, where would we be today? Right? Where would we be today? All right. So, Damascus is really old. Pattern welded steel is really old. It's not a new concept, right? So, let's talk about the modern use ish, All right, my experience, modern use with the modern techniques that I would call modern, but are basically the same that they were doing in 1500 BCE. So when I first made Damascus, I had no clue what I was doing. I was brand new to smithing, but I wanted to make Damascus. No idea how to forge weld. No idea how to do anything else. I wasn't freaking on YouTube. I didn't use YouTube to find things out. I had a basic knowledge of blacksmithing. And I read a few books, and I took two classes, and from two very talented smiths. And I was like, I'm gonna do this. This is what I'm gonna do. There's there's no going back, right? I'm gonna do this come hell or high water. Period. And so what I did for the first one was take mild steel, mild strap steel, and forge welded it to a lawnmower blade, and then cut and stacked. And this was just me, using what I had read and what kind of made sense to me, except for I wasn't using the right steel. That was my first dive into forge welding, and it worked. I mean, I got a piece that was pattern welded steel, random pattern Damascus. It was mild steel with basically 1075 lawnmower blade rolled in a mix. And it was exhilarating. It took me a long time. So it took me about 4 times as long then to do as it does for me to do it by hand today. Better techniques, more experience, right? And but it was the bug. It wasn't the bug that got me in to the craft, but it was the bug that bit me pretty freaking hard. And I don't do enough of it. I wish I could. I don't do enough of it. I mean, I could. I just don't. Because it can get expensive because you got to have material, right? And you're not at this stage. We're not using mild steel and lawnmower blade. So you got to buy it. If I'm doing a full Damascus blade with no core, and I'm using, even if it's a canister, I'm using high carbon powder and a high carbon freaking other material. If it's a solid piece, no core put in there, so you're not tiling, or you're not sand mine, you're not taking the two halves of that like, let's say if it's ball bearing canister Damascus, we're not taking that and laying it over something else. Or if it's, let's say I'm throwing random pieces of cutoffs from my 1018 from whatever I've been working on. 1018's mild weld steel. So I'm not taking that steel and throwing it in the mix. If I was and I had a core, then I would wrap it around a core, or I'd sandwich it on either side. My core piece being a 52-100, 1095, 1084, 1075, what have you. You could even go a 1045 if you were looking for that type of steel to work with. All right. So my thoughts on Damascus, and I did eventually learn a lot from I can never remember his name. He's on YouTube. Ty. Trenton tie. And I did, in his method of forge welding, the steps he takes, the it's not necessarily a step. It's more of a, I guess you'd say, um, heats that he takes, and how he swings his hammer. It has helped me so much, and I teach this all the time when I'm teaching forge welding. Period. Is quarter, half, three quarter, full. So quarter blow, half blow, three quarter blow, full blow. So those four stages. So basically, they eventually end up being four heats if you do it right. With a hand hammer, you might take a few extra heats to do a forge weld, to do a billet weld, right? So if you're doing like a Damascus billet weld, you're probably going to take a little more heats in the quarter blow range. I tend to have, if you're experienced with a hammer, you tend to get in there at around uh you know 2 to 3 quarter blow heats to get the forge weld to set, and then you're moving on from that point. 2 to 3. You can get it with one if you're really quick and you've done really good prep on your steel, right? Because that's where the real magic happens, is the prep. If you don't do good enough prep, it doesn't matter, especially with a carbon steel. I mean, you can forge well without a flux or anything like that with your on mild steel or wrought iron. You still need to prep a little bit, but your prep happens hot, right? And you do a lot of brushing, and to get that scale while it's super hot, but you got to be quick, and so it's a lot of practice to be able to do it like that. All right. Now, when we're doing Damascus, there's a couple different ways that you can set up your billet. You can do it what I call dirty welds, and a dirty wet weld. So a dirty wet weld is, you take a piece of steel that you haven't cleaned, right? Completely, scaled over, everything like that, and you heat that up. Then you take your flux and you sprinkle flux on it. Flux is basically a solvent. When it heats up, it eats away that scale, traps it. What it also does is, after it cleans and eats that steel up, because it is it's a detergent, so it's a cleaner, right? The flux is. So once it gets heated up and becomes molten on top of your steel, and picks up dirt, grime, oils, everything, and traps it in itself, it then protects that surface. All right. So then what you do is you take and you heat up another piece while the other piece is heating, and you put a little bit of flux on that piece, and then you float the two pieces together. Just take them in your forge and you're floating them on top. That's just sitting. There's your two pieces that you're wanting to forge weld together. So if you want to stack, you have a 1090, a 15 and 20 you start with, and then a 1095, and then a 15 and 20, and then you rotate that back through so that your parent material, your 1095, is on the center. You're gonna start with your 15 and 20, or you can start with your 1095 and go 15 and 20, 1095, 15 and 20, 1095, 15 and 20. Doesn't really matter. But we're gonna start with 3 layers, because we're gonna cut and stack this, and they're gonna be thick. You're probably gonna want half-inch thick pieces, half-inch thick pieces of 1095 and 15 and 20, and you're gonna want them to be roughly. I have a 2-inch face on my workhorse hammer, and so I'll do them 2-inch by 2-inch square. All right. And so I'll prep a pool on my first piece, the most outer piece that I want. So it'd be 15 and 20. And then I'll do the same thing to the next piece, right? But it'll be 1095, and I'm floating, and I'm basically gonna prep that up with flux, clean it, have the flux clean it in the fire, and then I'm gonna float those. So you have your 1095, a pool of flux, and then you have your 15 and 20, and you just sitting in there floating it, and you bring it out, and you bam, quarter blow it, and it squeezes all that crap and shit that was collected, all the scale, all the dirt, all the oils and everything. They've been burnt off, and now it's two clean surfaces mating together. Bam, right there. And then you start over again. You do it again. Bam, you do another dirty weld. That's a fun way of doing it. And that's how I did my first mosaic. Was dirty wet welds. Was that I had my stock that I wanted to use, I had it all laid out, and I just bam, did it like that. Dirty wet weld. It's fun, it's cool, it's hot, it's tiring. It's just a blast. It is absolutely a blast. It's a lot of fun. And you get the bug again. You're like, man, that was great. So that's the dirty wet weld. And then you have a basically a clean wet weld, right? That you can do on a billet. And a clean wet weld is when you're and you can do this same technique. So as the dirty wet weld, but for a clean wet weld, you've cleaned your surfaces, and then you're using flux to protect that surface. So you're gonna clean up your surfaces that you want to mate together, and it's a little quicker. All right, a lot less flux needed, and you stick your pieces in there, and you flux them. Let the flux get molten. Let the pieces come up to temperature, and you're talking, right around 21 to 2200 degrees. In there, and you're looking at a really bright yellow color on the inside of your oven, and you're waiting for the pieces in there to disappear against the background. All right. So then you're sitting there, and you mate those two together, and you've already cleaned them. So all you're doing is protecting them from being oxidized. That is the big thing. What is going to stop you every time is oxidation of your surfaces and not cleaning your steel well enough. If you're not going to clean your steel, like with a belt sander, or even a wire brush will do it, like a on an angle grinder. If you're not going to do that, then you got to use a lot more flux. And then you got to protect your inside of your forge or rebuild it more often. There are various ways to protect your forge from being eaten alive by the flux. You can use bubble alumina. There's, what is it? TC1000 and bubble alumina. TC1000 is a reflectant. Bubble alumina is an anti-corrosive that you would coat your forge with, and it prolongs the life of the bricks and your lining. Otherwise, you're going to be rebuilding your forge every time you go to Forge Weld. All right. Now you may be asking yourself, why am I using these techniques? Why am I using the float method, of forge welding on Damascus, on pattern welded steel? Well, not everybody has access to an electric welder. Not everybody has access to a torch to do a torch weld, or anything like that. This is a way that, and I didn't learn this from anybody. I want you guys to understand that. No one taught me this, and I never read this technique anywhere. This technique came about because I didn't have a welder and I wanted to make Damascus. My welder at the time was basically on the fritz. I was in between welders, didn't have access to one. But I knew enough about blacksmithing, the properties of forge welding, that I didn't develop this. I want everybody to understand that. This is not, I did not develop this. I'm not claiming I developed it. I'm pretty sure this is a technique out there that's been used for forever. And it's a basic technique of forge welding. But I hadn't, to this point, read it anywhere. And so I just did the next thing. I knew what I had to do. I knew what came about of it. And so you float your pieces in there, let the flux clean it, and then forge weld together. It is a long process, but it is so much fun. You get a lot of technique work, you get a lot of smithing involved. There's just a lot of time in the fire, at the anvil, swinging a hammer. All right. You do not want to use a press. All right, at this point. You have to get rid of that flux. You have to. You have to be able to, you have to hit it hard enough to where it forcibly removes that flux. And so setting a weld with a press is great if you're using a technique we're going to talk about here pretty soon. But it's not ideal when you're doing it a wet weld. You want to tap that with a hammer, quarter blow that with a hammer. Now, if you have a power hammer, fine, great. Go to town, have fun. It'll do the same thing. It'll remove that, right? It'll remove that flux. That's what you need to do. You have to remove the flux after it does its job. Wash, rinse, and repeat. So that is the dirty wet weld and the clean wet weld when you're using the float method, when you're floating your pieces on top of each other, on top of a pool of flux. All right. So then you have what a lot of people do, a normal billet stack, right? Now, I didn't talk about another process you could do if you don't have a welder. You could wire these together, but you need to do a clean. Let's just talk about that real quick. There's the wire method, which was used a lot of. I mean, still is, and I've used it. I've had some of the best forge welds from doing the wire method, mainly because I don't use a gas on my welder, and so every time when you do a tack, you're pushing a little bit of that nasty flux splatter into your billet, and so you're going to lose a little bit more of your billet. The wire method it's still a clean method, right? So you clean your pieces with a file would work too. A file, if you anneal your pieces first, file clean them up. You could use a steel scraper, as well, a hand scraper for steel, once it's been annealed. But just clean your pieces. And then you get your stack put together. And then you wire it in 3 places: the end, the middle, both ends in the middle. And you want to use a wire that'll burn off. So it doesn't need to be there very long. Basically after the first hit, it's gone. And right away if you're stuck, if you're welded, because your billet's not falling apart. That's another good way of doing it. Another good way, if you have the ability to really clean your steel, then that's a really good way. If you have access to the power equipment. Now in the Floor School Education Center blacksmith competition, The dirty wet weld is the perfect way to forge weld at an event when you don't have access to powered equipment to clean that steel. The dirty wet weld. When you're out demonstrating, when you're out in a competition and you got it, and you have to do a forge weld of you know put together a billet of some sort. That's the way I would do it. The wire weld is great for when you can clean your steel, wire it up, heat it up, flux the ends, let the flux run down through the layers, and then you take that first quarter blow heat, bam, and you set your welds. Now, that first blow is probably not going to separate the wire from the billet. The second one might. All right, the wire will just be gone, and it's thin enough wire to where it's not going to become part of your billet. It's going to basically it'll fuse itself to the outside, but it'll eventually come off as scale. So you're not going to have to worry about that. So that's the wire weld. When you clean your steel and you wire it together, or you clean your if you can do it with any welds, really. You can do it with a scarf weld. Forge your scarf, file your scarf clean, the areas they're going to be touching, and then you wire them together, and then do the forge weld. You still get to put flux in there. So when you're wrapping your wire around that scarf, and some of you are probably like, what the hell's a scarf weld? Go look it up, scarf weld. And when you're wiring those two together, you don't want to wire it, put so much wire on it you can't. The flux it's going to get in there because it's going to become molten and seep through it. There's expansion of when you heat up metal, and so it's going to get in there. But you don't have to wire it like it's going to stay there. You just need to wire it so when you hold on to your piece that you're holding on to, the other piece doesn't move or fall off. All right, so just because you don't have a welder or access to a welder doesn't mean you can't be out there working. There are numerous ways to do this. All right, so that's the wire method. The next method is the most common method for how people start out is the stacking method, where you use a welder, a TIG, a MIG, a stick, a torch with some filler rod to, once you clean your surfaces, you then tack them together. Normally you tack your ends and corners and your middles. So you hit your corners, you hit the ends down the middle. So you got your corners and middles. So you got the four corners and the four middles. You run a bead down through it. And then you put a stick on the end of it, or you have a long piece as like your centerpiece is longer than everything else, and so you have something to grab onto with a pair of tongs. I like that method a lot, where you leave that, if you have a 4-inch billet, then and you have access to abundance amount of steel, you cut your core piece, your center piece, to where it's, right around 2 inches, 1.5 to 2 inches longer than everything else. Because then you can grab onto it with a pair of tongs. You put it in the forge. Now, here's where there's divergent schools of thought. All right, they all work, but some people like to strictly forge with flux, which is, a borax based, a detergent based powder, and you can get expensive fluxes. You can go down to your local store and buy borax. It's cheap. A laundry detergent, it's cheap. It works really good. Keep it dry, keep it clean. It'll be fine. You can dry it out by heating it up slowly. Make sure there's no water in it. You know, things you can do to make it better. There's ones that then they still use the flux, but they also soak in. They do a kerosene soak. They'll coat it in kerosene and stick it in the forge. That helps protect it. This the kerosene petroleum based. It's gonna help protect against oxidation of the layers while you're heating it up, so that you don't take a chance of forming an oxidative layer in there, which is what we call scale in there. And then you bring it out and you flux it. It's just there to especially if you're not grinding everything out, like any divots or anything. So if you have any void in there, even the smallest void, their best bet is to put some kerosene on it. WD-40 works too. Soak it in an oil-based liquid. That'll work as well. And what happens is that it allows you to heat that billet up hot enough to melt the flux. The flux gets down inside there, cleans everything out, protects that barrier, and then on your first hammer hit, you knock all that crap out of there. Everything comes out. Bam. All right. So that, and then there's another school of thought to where they just use kerosene or WD-40 to protect the billet, as their antioxidant, right? And I've done some WD-40 welding, and it does work. It's a whole lot more forgiving on your equipment, on your forge, for sure. And it's people that do use it, that swear by it, they guarantee 100% every time. That's experience. That's their experience talking. All right. There's only one true way. There's two true ways to get 100% every time. You still need the experience behind it. The one way, now we've talked about, let's go back and we've talked about a dirty wet weld where we're floating, a clean wet weld where we're floating, a wire welding where we're wrapping our billet, our scarf, our forge welding project together with wire, fluxing. It's all wet so far. Kerosene, WD-40, it's all wet. There's no dry welds yet. All right. So up until this point, we've used some sort of flux, whether it be kerosene, WD-40, borax, high-end freaking forge welding flux, whatever. Some people use sand. It doesn't work as well on high carbon, but you can use sand because it melts, turns into a glass when it's liquid, protects the steel. It doesn't clean it as well, right? It will, but not as good as, because it's not necessarily a solvent. Kerosene, WD-40, they're all solvents. Borax, it's a solvent, detergent, cleaner, but it's all wet at this point. The next stage of getting a 100%, I can testify to this. This is a 100% method when outside of using a canister, is a dry weld. Dry, non-atmospheric. And so basically what you do is you take your pieces, right? And you still have to create a box, right? But let's say you're stacking 1095, 15, and 20. So the outermost layers are going to be, so you have your 15 and 20, 1095, 15 and 20, 1095 in the middle, 15 and 20, 1095, 15 and 20. Always have, there's another thing that I want you guys to understand. You might have picked it up. Always make sure, it's a good practice to get into. It's not really needed these days, but it's a good practice to always adhere to, is always make sure your billets are an odd number of layers. Why is that? Well, if you're always making sure your billets are an odd number of layers, your 1095, your 1084, your 1075, your 1045, your 52100, your 5160, whatever, your 80 CRV, whatever it is, will always be in the center. And then you also always do, when you're doing a layered billet, a odd stack for the same reason. So if you're cutting it up and stacking it, you cut it in thirds. All right. Today it's not so needed because the 15 and 20 we use is a high carbon alloy steel with nickel in it. It's not as important, but it is a good practice to get into. Always keep your billets odd and your cuts odd. And always have the outermost layers be the offset, the shiny part. Always have your nickel on the outside when you're messing with 15 and 20. It's good practice to get into. So it's also because of that, if you get into that practice, when you actually start using like a pure nickel or gold or copper or something like that to put in there, you already have those techniques made and built to where you aren't going to have that soft material anywhere near being on as the core. All right. So moving on. I had to jump off the track there a little bit. Where were we? Non-atmospheric dry weld. A dry weld. It's my favorite weld. It's, it's easy. You need a welder of some sort. TIG, MIG, stick. You need a torch with filler rod. Doesn't matter. But you need to be able to weld it. And so basically what you do is you take your stack and you clean them up. All surfaces cleaned up. They're touching together. Make sure that they're of equal width and length. And then you're basically going to take really thin sheet metal and you're going to make a box around it using the top and bottom of your stack as the other two sides of that box. And you're going to enclose that whole piece in there with weld. You're going to weld your seams. Bam. You're going to weld around the top. You're going to weld the corners. You're going to weld around the ends. And there you go. You've now and you're going to put a handle on the end of it. I get 100% weld every time. And you have a lot less waste. A lot. You're wasting a third of what you did before. Maybe less. It's a great way to do it. All right, if you're doing just normal random pattern Damascus. And you could do the box method, at any stage if you want. But once you get to where the reason the box method is so great because you have these big billets where you have a million seams to freaking weld, because that's another way to do it is you go in and you weld each seam, right? You have a little more drop at that point, but still a dry weld, non-atmospheric dry weld at that point. You end up wasting a lot of wire, a lot of rod, a lot of filler. You could go in there with a TIG and then just no filler, just TIG the seams together, especially if you had if you alternated your pieces to where you left if your 15 and 20 was slightly smaller than your 1095, right? And you used that little lip from your 1095 as the filler for your TIG, that'd work too. Use what you have. That's a good way to do it, because then there's no loss at all. You're using 1095 as the filler to seal this billet up to make a non-atmospheric, right? So then you get in and you're sitting there and you're welding right then. Now it's a little more prep. Like I said, a little more prep from bam, you're in the fire, you're using the flux and heat to clean your steel, you're floating, you're welding, you're bam, right there at temperature, boom. All the way up until it gradually gets more and more prep involved. Longer time before you get in the forge. Right? That's the beauty of the first one we talked about, was the wet dirty weld, is your bam, you're in the forge. Right then, bam, right there. Forge temperature, you're forge welding within, however many minutes it takes your forge to get to forge welding temp. That's, it's you cut little corners when it comes to cleaning, but you can get the same outcome. A little more work, but you're forced, you're working, you're not cleaning, you're not doing this, just kind of menial. Oh, I gotta sand each surface, and we gotta make sure they're all clean of oil. Blah 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 blah. It's not any fun. Everybody just wants to get in the forge, so that's where the wet dirty weld comes into play, where you're just floating those two different float methods, where you're just floating it on a pool of liquid flux. All right, so we have the non-atmospheric, where we're creating a anaerobic environment in there, cutting off the oxygen. The surfaces are clean. There's absolutely no, there's a step in there in the cleaning process where you can, when you grind them down, I like soaking them and letting them sit. I basically, while I'm stacking them, they sit in fingernail polish remover, so that they are absolutely as clean as possible when they come together in this process. Since you're not using a flux, the cleaner the better. Let me tell you what, you have to take those extra steps to make sure that there's nothing in there. All right. So now we're moving from the stack into canister. Canister is the next non-atmospheric. All right. Well, yeah, the next non-atmospheric that anybody can do. You don't need a press to do it. I've done it with a hand hammer. It's a little harder, but it can be done. All right, you take your canister, you take your can, you weld a bottom to it. Take and coat the inside of that canister that you make with a titanium oxide based material. So, white spray paint that says titanium oxide in the ingredients, or fingernail polish remover. Or you can do the carbon method, or graphite method. Done that. They all work to varying degrees. The key is that if you want to get that can off right away, you coat the inside of it. If you don't care, then don't coat it. You just get to grind it off anyways. Don't coat it. The scaling method, it works. No, when I say scaling method, like stick your canister in your forge and let it scale up, because something that has scale on it, they won't forge together, right? but it works, but it's not uh, my suggested method. All right. Coat the inside of your canister with the titanium oxide. You can do it with a graphite too. A spray graphite works just as well. Um, I put you want to put a tiny little bit of, you don't have to do this, but it hasn't failed me yet. Put a little bit of a carbon material at the bottom. So I put a little bit of charcoal powder at the bottom. I put my ball bearings, whatever I have in there. I put my powder. Make sure it goes all the way to the bottom. Probably best also to put a little of your powder at the bottom too before you add your stuff. On top of that carbon source. What that carbon source does, it acts as a antioxidizer. So what it does, it'll burn up any excess oxygen within that can when it gets to temperature. All right, because it is creating. That's how you created an anaerobic environment in there. It's once you're at temperature, that antioxidant in there has burned up, has used the oxygen, so it's not having time to oxidize anything else because it's burning that carbon source within that can. All right, and you can help mitigate your sort. You stick when we get to the vent hole we're going to put in this thing eventually, you can stick a plug in there that'll eventually burn out throughout the process. One more source of, ignition point to eat up that oxygen that's in that can. You add your pieces, you compress it, you put a cap on the other side, and you weld it shut. Even if your welds aren't good, tap a little freaking vent hole in there. Because what's going to happen is that those ignition sources that are in there, whether they're oils, whether they're charcoal powder, whether it's, if you watch Sharap on YouTube, he uses chilies and pepper, and it's a cool way of just adding a carbon source to burn. Always put a vent hole in there, and then you can plug that vent hole so none of your powder escapes while getting up to temperature. Otherwise you'll see this little jet start to form in there, and you'll lose a little bit of powder on the ends if you don't plug that hole. Like a toothpick will work, right? So you get that, you bring it out, and you put it through your press, or you put it to your hammer. Bam, you have now started your process of making canister Damascus. It's pretty simple. You don't have to go to mosaics at that point. Mosaics is just another step in the process. We already talked about the mosaics, and so we won't really get into that. That's a subcategory. Just a sub step that after you've already forge welded it together, then you forge weld it some more. And just so we all know, forge welding is not the same as regular welding. We're actually fusing at a molecular level, right? We're basically heating it up. The molecules expand, the spaces in between them get bigger, and then we use pressure to shove them together. Now, as I'm, for you guys to do this, you can hold your hands up together with your palms facing you. Your two middle fingers touch them, and then think about, as it heats up, the spaces between your fingers get bigger, and then with the pressure, you slide your fingers in between each of the gaps. And that's what's happening at a molecular level. All right. The next step in this is crucible. It's a non-atmospheric. So what you do in crucible, and this will be the last thing we talk about before we get out of here today. The crucible Damascus is when you take a clay crucible, clay graphite, crucible, and you add your material in the bottom. You add you can add a little carbon in there, charcoal powder, if you like. Not very much, just a dusting, if you want. Graphite, maybe some extra graphite at the bottom, if you want. You add crushed glass, all right, to it. A waxy leaf, a piece of charcoal on top of that, a lump charcoal on top of that, and then you seal that crucible. Absolutely. Seal it completely. You put it in your foundry furnace or in your forge, or if in a brick forge, charcoal forge, whatever you have, you put it in there and you fire it. And then you let it cool completely down. You crack your top on it, and that piece of charcoal should still be there. Now that's extreme layman explanation of it. We could do a complete episode, and we will, on crucible steel alone. But we're gonna call it. We're gonna wrap this up for today. We've been going for about an hour and 13 minutes, so we're gonna get you guys out of here. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and as always, stay safe out there, be well, and forge on.